So, and of course, when Moro, was joining that, was joining Bolsonaro's government, he, as you say in the book, like at that time, Bolsonaro, for obvious reasons, right? Because everybody, sort of, you know, knew who he was. But Moro seemed like super upstanding. So Bolsonaro really at that stage needed Moro much more than vice versa. And he was for a while maybe able to give lend some of his credibility, but then these leaks that you published were really damning about a lot of people, but Moro most of all. So you want to talk a little bit about the the like what the well actually. I want to be respectful of your time, but just a little bit about how like the process and then what the leaks themselves revealed.
Yeah, and sure, we can. I mean, I'm not super pressed for time, so whatever you feel is a good amount of time, I'm happy to give you. Yeah, so it was on Mother's Day in 2019. So May, I think it was 11th, 2019. So just like 4 months after Bolsonaro was inaugurated, and not just Bolsonaro, but his entire far-right party that didn't even exist barely before the 2018 election got swept into power with him. They became the second largest party in Congress, just one seat less than the Workers' Party. So this very far-right movement took over Brazil under the leadership of somebody who has been saying for 30 years that they believe the military dictatorship is a superior form of government to Brazilian democracy, vowing to close the Congress and the courts. If he ever got reelected, saying the only thing, if he ever got elected president, saying the only thing the military dictatorship did wrong was that it didn't kill enough people. It tortured a lot, but didn't kill them after. So it was a very menacing time, and people were afraid for obvious reasons. No one knew the path to Brazil. And on Mother's Day, I got a call from a woman named Manuela Davila, very famous politician in Brazil. She's actually a member of the Brazilian Communist Party. And she's been a congresswoman in a state legislature with huge vote total. She's very dynamic and young and popular. And she was the vice presidential candidate for the left-wing ticket that made the runoff against Bolsonaro and lost. And she called me and said, I have to speak with you urgently. And she's a very serious woman. I knew she wasn't doing that for nothing. And so I got on the phone with her and also my husband. And she said earlier that day, in fact, like an hour earlier, she had been hacked. Her phone had been hacked by a hacker who began talking to her from the phone of a senator. He had hacked the phone of the senator as well and pretended to be the senator for a while and then said, look, I have all your conversations that you've had with your closest colleagues, with senators, with governors, with your friends. Here they are. He showed it to her to prove to her that he had hacked her phone. And she obviously thought, like, am I being blackmailed? And then he said, no, you're not my target. I just am doing this to show you that I really am the real deal, that I have the capacity to invade anybody's Telegram account that I want. Telegram is the, encrypted app that is most popular in Brazil. It's like Signal. Mm-hmm. And he said, I've spent months hacking into the phones of Brazil's most powerful people, including Judge Moro, the entire prosecutorial task force, and others. And I've downloaded a gigantic archive proving grave corruption on the part of the judge, on the part of that task force. And they talked about what they should do, and they agreed that they should contact me because of the work I had done with the Snowden archive would enable me to know how to do it. So she called me and said, she told me what happened and said, are you willing to talk to him? And I said, of course. And I began talking to him. And within, I don't know, maybe an hour, after I became convinced that he was serious, that he wasn't there to entrap me into a crime, he began uploading onto my phone this enormous archive, one document after the next. And, every 3 seconds, a new document would materialize on my phone. And it, he said, I think it'll take 2 days. It went on for day after day after day after day. 8 days later, it was still, uploading, nowhere, no end in sight. And I realized this was a bigger archive than even the Snowden archive, which at the time had been the biggest leak in modern journalistic history. So we ended up creating a kind of encrypted Dropbox, and I wanted to make sure the documents were secure outside of Brazil, because remember, the primary target is Sergio Moro, who's now in charge of every component of domestic surveillance, electronic monitoring, law enforcement. So I was very concerned that he was going to detect or find out what was going on, given the magnitude of the leak. I wasn't certain how careful the source was being. And I was very concerned that they would be able to get a prior restraint order from any judge, given how dominant he was in the judiciary, preventing us from publishing. And so the first priority was to secure a full copy in various parts around the world, which is the same strategy I used when I got the Snowden archive. And we began then researching it kind of even before that, kind of on the first day. The first day, I remember my colleague and I, a young Brazilian reporter, Victor Pugi, and I just began arbitrarily and randomly opening files. And we saw this archive that was 5 years worth of chats, secret chats, between Judge Moro and the chief of the task force, the prosecutorial task force. They shouldn't have been talking at all, right? Because Sergio Moro was the judge judging the charges that were being brought by these prosecutors. It's the same system as in the US, where the judge is supposed to be equidistant between the parties, the prosecution and the defendant. It's not like in Spain or Italy where the judge is the investigator. So he was plotting the whole time. We saw the first day how to make sure that not just Lula, but also Lula, how the charges should be brought, how he would rule, how to make sure that it withstood appeal. He was ordering, what kind of public campaign should be implemented to prepare the public that Lula was going to prison. He was plotting with the prosecutors the entire time. And we saw conversations where they were saying that we know the case is weak. We need to keep it with you. It was just utter, flagrant fraud. And so pretty much from the first day, I knew this is going to be a archive that whatever else was in there was going to really shake the Bolsonaro government at its foundations.
Yeah. So how, obviously, as you said, you're very concerned, for obvious reasons, that about how, like Moro as somebody who had this super justice minister, position, and was also, so damningly implicated in these leaks, was going to react to this. And when you did start publishing things, I think you put out three documents, at once to sort of establish that no, there's really something here, and so that to make it harder for them to try to stop future releases, but there were extensive attempts to use the force of the Brazilian legal system to crack down to stop this process.
Oh yeah, I mean we published 3 articles and probably 40 documents on one day, the first day, along with an editor's note saying look, we have this gigantic archive and we're going to be doing this for at least a year. This isn't going to stop. It was really kind of I thought about it as a shock and awe campaign. I really wanted to knock them back on their heels, to make them be on the defensive. I didn't want to just start with a small story. I wanted to show this is an archive that needed to be in the public eye. It was very similar to the strategy I did with Snowden as well. I published 5 articles the first 5 days, one after the next, just to keep the US government on its heels. And, part of the reaction, the backlash at first was just the kind of, because remember, you have the Bolsonaro movement that was obviously powerful enough to elect this person who had been on the political fringes for decades, now joined at the hip with Sergio Moro's very powerful following as well. They were inextricably linked. So these two movements were tied together, and they viewed each of them, this reporting, as threatening to them. And so I was kind of the target of this, amalgamated movement of Bolsonaro's hardcore right-wing followers and Sergio Moro's law and order authoritarian fans. And, the first kind of thing that would happen was there were hashtag campaigns that were every day. I would say for 2 months, my name was at the top of, Twitter's trending topics in Brazil, calling for my deportation, for my imprisonment, for my arrest. They started forging documents purporting to show that I had paid Russian hackers in Bitcoins to do the hacking. But the most menacing part was the official. Yeah, that's a chart that purports to show. You can see there. It was a very convoluted conspiracy theory, but this was put on in one of the major news weeklies, like the Time or the Newsweek of Brazil. And the theory was that I had been able to gain access to Telegram because Snowden was friends with the two Russian founders of Telegram, the two brothers. And then at the same time, I had wired, you can see there $300,000 in Bitcoin to Russian hackers. It didn't even make sense if I had access to Telegram through the founders. Why would I need to pay Russian hackers? But that was the cover stories. And you know, Bolsonaro's son brought it to the Senate when I had to, that was the cover. That was showing the theory on the trail of Moro's hacker. And so it was crazy. It was insane. You know, both Moro and I got called to testify before the joint the committees of Congress, where we testified each for 9 hours the whole time I was being threatened with jail by Bolsonaro's allies. But it took them about a month. And after about a month of that kind of stuff, just like fake news constantly, we heard from friends in our lives who were being offered money to talk about our personal lives, to lie about us, stuff like that. We got really deeply personal death threats, you know, not the kind that you get routinely if you're a public figure, like, I hope you die, or you're going to get what's coming to you, or watch your back, but like very like non-public information about our home address, about where our kids went to school, and like deeply disturbed threats. So we had to, you know, have armed security and ride around in armored vehicles of the kind that would have saved Marielle had she been in one. But it was really about a month later when they started their official retaliation. So one of the agencies that reported to Judge Moro was one that's supposed to track movements of politicians and their family members. And they leaked to the press that they had initiated a formal investigation into my finances. Remember, I've lived in Brazil 15 years by this point. I had never been the target of any investigation of any kind. Suddenly, a month after I do this reporting on Moro, one of his agencies leaks that they're doing a formal investigation of my finances. And a center-left party, this kind of environmental green party, went to the Supreme Court and petitioned this court, put us up to the investigations on the grounds that it violated press freedoms. And the Supreme Court ruled in my favor, issued this stirring press freedom ruling, barring any investigations of me in connection with this reporting. So then about 2 weeks after that, they leaked to the press that they were investigating David on grounds that they thought that he might have committed financial fraud. You know, a bunch of public events that I appeared at had to be canceled because of death threats. At some, I had to speak like from an offshore boat, and they shot fireworks at me and the crowd horizontally. That was me arriving, you know, by a little fisherman's boat to the offshore boat that they made me speak on, because that was the only way they could guarantee my privacy. As people know, I got physically attacked once on the air by a right-wing pro-Bolsonaro judge or journalist. This was actually the day before Lula was freed from prison by the Supreme Court because of our reporting. So they knew it was going to happen. Tensions were very, very high. The right wing was furious that we had gotten Lula freed from jail, and that was the result. But you know, the most kind of severe and extreme reaction was in January of 2020, about 6 months after the reporting began. The month earlier, the federal police, which reported to Sergio Moro, concluded their investigation into the hacking. They identified who they said were the hackers. They arrested 6 people and accused them of being my source. But they also concluded in a report they released to the public, a very long section about me, that they investigated every conceivable, you know, word that I had said, every action I had taken, and that they could find no evidence of any kind that I ever got near the line of criminality. To the contrary, the federal police said I was always very cautious and professional in the exercise of my duties as a journalist. So we assumed, you know, Bolsonaro the whole time was threatening that I would be in prison. He kept saying, Glenn doesn't need to worry about deportation. He entered this fraudulent marriage with a congressman. They did a fraudulent adoption of 2 Brazilian kids. That means we can't deport him.
That would be some really impressive planning.
Yeah, I mean, I married David in 2005 before I was even a journalist. So I would have had to have been so prescient that 15 years later, I would need a shield against deportation. And also, why would I adopt 2 kids, since being married to a Brazilian national is its own absolute shield against deportation? But it's Bolsonaro. So he's just throwing stuff out about our family.
it's also kind of funny, right? Because Bolsonaro, and his supporters have also said all sorts of really ugly homophobic things about you, So it's like, well, wait a second, are you, is it a fake marriage? Are you pretending to be married to a man? What's the accusation here?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the point of bringing in, I remember really well. He was at a press conference because Sergio Moro issued this really bizarre decree giving himself the right to summarily deport any non-citizen for any reason in a way that wasn't appealable. And everyone perceived that it was directed at me. That was the assumption. And they asked Bolsonaro about it a day or so later. And that was when he said, look, Glenn doesn't need to be worried about being deported. He's married to a Brazilian man. They adopted 2 Brazilian boys. It was very deliberate to stoke this, a big part of his campaign was that gay men were attempting to take over the schools in order to recruit children to become gay using this thing called a gay kit, kind of triggering the primal instinct of parents to protect children from pedophiles. It's a very religious country, evangelical and Catholic. He rode to the presidency in part on the kind of he was an expert at doing that. And that was really the point. But he did threaten me with prison. He said he doesn't need to worry about deportation, but there's a good chance I'll be spending a lot of time behind bars here in Brazil. And so once the federal police, issued this report exonerating me, we figured that was the end of that threat. And then the next month I was on vacation with my family, scrolling through my phone while I was getting ready to ride a horse with my son. And I saw, breaking, urgent, Glenn Greenwald, criminally charged. That was the tweet that I saw, the first one. So it's the MPF is the Ministry of Public. The MPF is the Justice Department equivalent, denounces Glenn Greenwald and 6 other people, which were the hackers, for the hacking invasion. And I was, I didn't know what to make of that. It seems pretty clear, but I thought maybe I just misread it. Maybe, and then I started seeing every news outlet instantly reporting it. And I was charged criminally by these prosecutors inside a federal Ministry of Prosecutors, which is the MPF, as being part of a conspiracy with my 6 sources. And so every crime that they were alleged to have committed was being imputed to me. So I was charged with, I think it was 123 felony counts that had a total of 320 years in prison or something like that. And that was obviously unpleasant because you don't know, what courts are capable of doing. Remember, these courts have been very deferential to Moro the whole time. They sent Lula da Silva to prison. So, I'm thinking look, if they can send Lula to prison, they can certainly send me to prison. Right. I knew I hadn't done anything criminal. I knew I hadn't done anything wrong, but it was still very alarming. And it took about a month, and this right-wing judge who got the case, we were very worried about that, wrote an opinion saying, in Brazil, the way it works is unlike in the US where the Justice Department indicts you when you're a defendant. In Brazil, when they bring charges against you, the court has to accept it. It's usually just a formality. They just accept the charges and then decide if you're guilty. But in this case, we filed a petition asking the judge not to accept it. And the judge said, essentially, I think there is evidence that he committed crimes. I would be willing to accept these charges against him. And in fact, I would even order him preventatively imprisoned, meaning imprisoned pending trial, given what a danger he has proven to be. But I'm forced by this Supreme Court ruling that was issued the year before in response to Bolsonaro and Moro's threats to dismiss the case because they have prohibited him from being investigated or charged. And the judge invited the Supreme Court. He said, I think it's probably a good idea if that order is reviewed to determine whether it's still valid in light of this new evidence. So he made very clear he wished he could have accepted that against me, but he couldn't because his hands were tied by the Supreme Court. Now, whether he really would have is hard to say. It obviously created a huge international repercussions. Every media outlet in the West condemned that. Every, presidential candidate in the Democratic field, like Bernie and Elizabeth Warren and Tulsi Gabbard and others, condemned it and defended me. Even Fox News was defending me, which has a big impact, a footprint with the Bolsonaro movement. Press freedom groups, the UN. So whether the judge really would have had the courage to do it, I don't know, but he said he would have absent that Supreme Court ruling. So the charges are now formally dismissed, but the prosecutors are appealing that dismissal. So it's currently within appellate court. They're asking the appellate court to reinstate those charges against me. But given how vindicated the reporting has been, which I assume we're going to talk about next, you know, I think it's very unlikely that will happen.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that. I mean, like, how has you know, like what's the you know, how has this played out? You know, since it was originally you know, reported, like in the last, I guess we're coming up close to 2 years.
Right. So you know, we started I think the first reports were published on June 9th. About 3 months later, 3.5 months later, in October, the Supreme Court ordered Lula released from prison. So he was in prison for about 18 months. He was in this like makeshift prison in Curitiba, which was the town where Sergio Moro was a judge, and where his defendants were imprisoned. I had interviewed him from that prison. And the Supreme Court, when they freed him from prison, used a technicality to do so. It wasn't that we showed that Moro was corrupt. They said that under the Constitution, as long as you have appeals pending that you haven't exhausted, you can't be ordered into prison. But the reality was, the only reason the Supreme Court could let Lula walk out of prison was because our reporting by that point had so damaged Moro's reputation that people were already starting to doubt whether Lula's conviction was in fact just. Now institutions were willing to stand up to Moro. He suffered a whole bunch of defeats in Congress as well. The whole kind of climate and framework in Brazil had shifted within months after the reporting. Polls showed that his approval rating was, you know, collapsing. But that didn't really exonerate Lula. That just said he can't be in prison pending appeal. They didn't touch the convictions themselves. And then about 6 weeks ago now, I guess, a judge on the Supreme Court, who has always been known as being very pro-Moro, very pro-car wash investigation, on his own issued a ruling that the case that convicted Lula should never have been with Judge Moro in the first place because he never really had jurisdiction. And that was part of our reporting. That was one of our first stories, that they knew, as I mentioned, that the case shouldn't have been with Judge Moro. So I think the video clip that you played at the beginning, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, which is a point worth underlining, you know, because in that video clip at the beginning, they sort of say, well, he's free to a technicality, but the technicality is more than a technicality, because what, you know, because it's, you know, like, this is part of this like scandalous behavior that it was that they made sure that it was illegitimately put under Moro because he was collaborating closely with the prosecutors and shaping their strategy, and was in no way, shape, or form a neutral party. And they were afraid of having it be judged by somebody who actually might be.
Well, so it kind of happened in two steps. So this headline that you're seeing was the second step. I think what happened was the video you played at you know, it happened very recently, so it's understandable. The video that you played, I think, was only after that first ruling that was technically a technicality, right? Right. We're not saying Lula was innocent. We're not saying Judge Moro did anything wrong. We're just saying that the case never should have been with Judge Moro in the first place.
Right.
And the reason this judge ruled that was because, like I said, he's a very pro-Moro, anti-Lula judge. He was afraid that because Lula had petitioned the full Supreme Court to rule on the merits, that our reporting proved that Moro was corrupt, that Moro was unjust and partial the entire time, and therefore the conviction should be nullified. And this judge, fearing that Lula was going to win, jumped in and tried to just kind of avert a ruling by saying, oh, just on this jurisdictional technicality, it should go to another judge. And what that could have done was that other judge could have just said, I looked at everything and I uphold the conviction. And the Supreme Court, the full Supreme Court, knowing that that was happening, said, no, we're going to finally get to the root of the matter, which is, was Judge Moro actually corrupt and biased the way this reporting showed in his conduct of the trial? In other words, are we going to annul the conviction, nullify the convictions of Lula? And so about a week or two after that one judge did that technicality that I think your video clip at the beginning was referencing, they ruled that yes, Judge Moro himself was corrupt, that he was biased, and that therefore Lula's convictions are invalidated in full. And what that means is that Lula's political rights, which were deprived when he was convicted, are now fully restored, which means that he's free to run for the presidency in 2022 against Bolsonaro, which everyone now expects him to do.
Right. So at the same time as all of this has happened, like the Bolsonaro government itself, has been like, making, as I understand it, some sending some fairly creepy signals, right? Like they commemorated the anniversary of the military coup in the 1960s.
As a revolution, yeah.
Yeah.
They heralded it as a revolution against tyranny, which was, the reason it's so creepy is because that was the original justification for the coup. And it basically had been outlawed. It basically has been illegal since redemocratization to talk about that coup that way, in a positive or favorable way. And Bolsonaro has filled his government, including his vice president, but now almost every cabinet minister, with generals. So it's basically, a more militarized government than even the military dictatorship itself, which, was led by the military, but would hire civilian experts to run policy. Bolsonaro just has militarized the entire government.
Yeah, which I think. I mean, I'm curious about how worried that makes you about what they might do now that Lula is in a position to to run again, that, and especially given that these people are openly have this history you were talking about earlier of openly praising and having these links to these right-wing paramilitary street gangs.
Yeah, and I mean, as I indicated earlier, for example, Dilma's impeachment, these recordings showed was done in conjunction with the military. The military is sort of like a deep state, right? It kind of, nothing happens of any significance without their buy-in. And when the Supreme Court, before our reporting 3 years ago, was scheduled to rule on whether Lula should be imprisoned, the military, these generals, issued these very menacing statements saying all citizens are keeping an eye on the Supreme Court, and we expect the law to be applied to, making clear that they wanted Lula in jail, and the Supreme Court sent him there. And clearly, they were on the side of Bolsonaro. And there's still a faction of the military that is, very extremist, doesn't believe in democracy, who's on Bolsonaro's side. But I think what has happened is, and it's, very hard to say, but, Brazilian democracy is now 35 years old, which means you have a lot of senior members of the military who were born into democracy, or at least came of age in democracy. And they've been, had it indoctrinated in their heads that their role is to be an apolitical military there to protect the Constitution and democracy. And a lot of them believe that. I think the military, there's a lot of good people in the military who I think are genuinely committed to that democratic model and to protecting it. And one of the things I think that our reporting has done more than anything was, for me, the big question when Bolsonaro got elected, and even when we set out to do the reporting, I knew that the Brazilian Constitution guaranteed more robust press freedoms than the US Constitution does. I knew the law says that if you're a journalist and you receive information from a source that was illegally obtained, you can't be prosecuted. But I didn't know, no one did, whether institutions in the Brazilian institutions have the ability or the will to stand up to Bolsonaro the way we saw US institutions doing with Trump. The media got adversarial, the citizens protested, members of Congress investigated and impeached. We weren't sure if Brazilian institutions, much younger, more fragile, beaten by financial crises and corruption, were able to do that. And I think the reporting kind of emboldened people that, no, we actually value democracy no matter where we are on the political spectrum. And so I do think Bolsonaro's plan is not so much a kind of classic military coup if he loses. What he's really trying to do is, his primary project now is to eliminate all gun control and to flood the population with weapons. And I think their model is very much to take what they look at and mock with mockery as this January 6th protest at the Capitol. They mock it. They're like, that was pathetic.
Yeah,
and
right.
They're like, that's what we want to do, but like for real, right?
Right.
So I don't think the danger so much is that the military as a whole is going to do a coup in Bolsonaro's favor, but I could easily see some kind of conflict between armed factions of the police, the population, and, factions within the military fighting on Bolsonaro's behalf or in favor of democracy. And obviously Bolsonaro's script is going to be Trump's script. Even before 2018, when he was stabbed on the campaign trail from his hospital bed, he had already said, there's no way I can lose this election unless the Workers' Party commits fraud. Right. And there's no possibility that if he loses, he's going to say, yeah, I lost fair and square. He's going to try and incite his now very armed followers who are fanatical to use violence to prevent him from being taken out of power. And that is a dangerous and volatile situation. No one knows what the outcome will be, but it's certainly something that's on everybody's minds.